Confederate Reckoning is the name of the book, Power and Politics in the Civil War South. The author is history professor Stephanie McCurry of the University of Pennsylvania. First of all, Professor McCurry, what is this painting on the front of your book?
This is a Civil War painting of a battleship going down, the Confederate flag going down in flames. It's an allegorical painting. It's not a military history, but I think it tells you a little bit about what the book's about.
Professor McCurry, if you would, start by giving us the demographics of the South in 1860 or so.
Yeah, that's a crucial question because they went to war, tried to make this new nation. They were smaller than the Union to start with, roughly 10 million people compared to the Union's 22. So that was already a tough row to hoe. But I think a military fact that's not it isn't as much paid attention to as it should be is 4 million of those 10 million people were black and enslaved. So when it came time to mobilize for war, they didn't have access to 10 million people. They had access to a white population of 6 million, half of whom were women, many of whom were under age. So the demographics were tough to start with.
How many white males at that point in the Confederate South? Because obviously that was their base.
Right. Well, I tried to figure out how many men were of voting age, right? That would be the link between voting and soldiering was very tight in the 19th century. And I figure there's about 1.5 million voting age white men. And then, of course, military age starts out smaller than that, 18 to 35. By the end of the war, it's 15 to 55.
What advantages going into the war, the Civil War, did, besides cotton, and we hear about cotton, at least we've heard about that for years as one of the advantages. What were the advantages for the South?
Well, I think it's hard for moderns to figure out how they thought they could do this. I mean, as Lee said, when they surrendered, they were overwhelmed by the numbers of men in arms. It's an industrial North, an agricultural South, a free labor North, a slave labor South. 2/3 of the capital of the South is in enslaved human beings. So they don't have, when they went to make the Confederate seal, they had to ship it out across the embargo and bring it back in. They did not have the capacity to make it. So it's a great question you ask because it's easy to list all the things they don't have. I think what they did have was a lot of confidence in their own political endeavor and a lot of faith that just as they had made the United States what it was between 1787 and 1860, that they could secede and make this other country independent, a nation state, and that they could build a proper nation state in the 19th century sense of the word on the basis of cotton and slaves. And they talked about this a lot at the time of secession, and for the first couple of years of the war, they compared themselves to other European countries in terms of population, natural resources, the value of the trade. They were riding high. I think it's the Confederacy's often misunderstood. We tend to think of it as a sort of defensive move. They were losing in the Union. They decided to, take this gamble. Well, they did take a gamble, but they were the only slaveholding class in the 19th century world who did it. The Cuban slaveholders didn't do it. The Brazilian slaveholders didn't do it. Why did these guys do it? That's a really interesting question, and I try to explain a little bit in the book, what was the mindset? It's completely fascinating to get inside the mind of this incredibly powerful, not just in terms of social power and wealth, but political power of this planter elite. And they were used to running the United States, and they really did not doubt their ability to do this separately. So the confidence is there, and it's a big piece of the story.
Was there overwhelming support for secession amongst the South?
No. It's a really, really interesting political campaign. I've written about it 3 or 4 times in my life, and I never cease to be amazed. It's as interesting as any campaign in modern history. Karl Rove would have been impressed. Most of the elite, the political elite, only 1/3 of white adult men owned slaves in the South at this point, and most of them didn't own very many. So the political elite that was orchestrating this, especially in the Deep South, they were extremely confident that they could do this, and they believed that they would be able to pull it off. And they didn't have any trouble aligning each other. But the real challenge for them was that this was theoretically a white man's democracy. Every adult white man got to vote. There were no property qualifications left. So they had to do this by electoral means. They had to sell it they had to win an election. And they were not at all confident about that. And there was an incredible amount of paramilitary violence and intimidation that went into it. And the results are very uneven. I mean, in South Carolina, they pulled it off. They called a convention and voted up secession by lunchtime on the first day, completely unanimously. That's how they went out of the Union. But what had preceded that? When you're in a meeting and everything's unanimous, don't you get a little suspicious? I mean, I do. And there was a lot of backstory to how they pulled that off. Other places, the backstory really showed. In Alabama, the upcountry representatives just charged that they were being run out of the Union, that democracy was being completely violated. People in Virginia looked at what was happening in the Deep South and said, no ordinary farmer has voted for this, that the elites have run us out of the Union without the proper consideration of democratic process. And it really was, I think it's interesting that it's very revealing of what democracy was and meant in a slave regime in 1860. They called it a democracy, although they often made the case, especially the political elite, that what they really wanted was a republic, and that a democracy was a mobocracy. And that was part of the reason they wanted out of the Union. They did not like the direction electoral politics was going, but they had to play that game to get secession through, and they strong-armed it through in numbers of states. And in the Upper South, remember, the normal democratic process did not yield secession. None of those Upper South states seceded until Fort Sumter was fired on. And even then, there were 8 Upper South states, and 4 of them seceded and 4 of them didn't. So they completely split. It was an incredibly contentious and divisive process. And it meant that the Confederacy ended up fighting with 11 slave states. Was that right? 7 Deep South and 4, 11 instead of 15. There were 15 slave states in 1860, only 11 states in the Confederacy. So you already see this breaking off of a part of the South, or the slave South, just never put its fate with the Confederacy.
Did Jefferson Davis ever win an election, an actual election?
He was a senator, but what Senate elections were in Mississippi?
President of CSA.
He was nominated in a constitutional convention as the moderate in Montgomery, Alabama, in February of 1861, and I don't think he ever did stand for election. One of the things that Americans think is that the Confederate Constitution, one of the things they're told, that the Confederate Constitution was a replica of the U.S. Constitution, but it wasn't. They made a number of crucial changes, and one of them was they had a one-term executive, and I believe it was a 5-year executive term, so he avoided re-election.
Professor McCurry, was there a lot of political infighting during the war in the South?
Yeah, there was, and there were no formal political parties. I mean, one of the things that's interesting about the Confederacy is that it so quickly was on the ropes, right? That a lot of things that were planned never really materialized. And there was political opposition, but it was in a clique kind of form. Theoretically, everybody was a Democrat. There was no Republican Party ticket offered in the South. You couldn't vote for Lincoln, certainly in the Deep South. I think in Virginia you could vote for Lincoln. But they were all allied with the southern wing of the Democratic Party. And during the war, opposition cliques arose, and some of them were profoundly opposed to the Davis administration on very good grounds that the Davis administration was one of the most centralizing, federally concentrated power regimes of the entirety of American history. I mean, one political scientist who looked at this looked at the Union government, the structure of the states and the federal government in the Union, and the structure of the states and the federal government in the Confederacy, and he said the Confederacy was the Leviathan state. And he said the United States never had a government that big and that top-down until the New Deal. So they seceded on states' rights, and then they had to proceeded to, because they had to build, this enormous central state apparatus. They conscripted within a year. I mean, think about that as a statement of state power. They conscripted within a year. They passed tax-in-kind taxes within basically a year. And They had agents of the federal government all over the South, literally taking food out of people's barns. It was the only way that they could feed the army. So